All right, I think we're live. All right, so this is interesting. So this started on Twitter, and here we are, less than a week later. So what's going on?
Yeah, not much. I think that started. I actually started listening to some podcasts that were interesting to me, and it sort of made me. I used to do a podcast with a friend. I was kind of wanting to get back into it, and so I figured, a good way to kind of practice, warm up, is to go on some other people's, and so then I was, introduced to you. So
Yeah. So how did you know? Where'd you know Kathleen from?
so I went to listen to her episode, and I don't think she mentioned Super Happy Dev House, but that is it seemed actually very relevant to the conversation at the time. But so that was an event that we all kind of organized as kind of like a group of friends that threw together this kind of big hackathon. I don't think of it as a hackathon today because hackathons usually imply competition stuff. This is kind of more of an open-ended, like casual jam kind of co-working event. Kind of before all of that stuff, co-working, and this was in like 2005, and then for about 5 years, Brad Newberg, who sort of coined co-working, was one of our, and started the first co-working spaces in San Francisco with Chris Messina. Just like the people that came to Dev House was kind of one of the most interesting things about it. But I actually knew Kathleen through a friend that I made before Dev House that sort of started it with us. Her husband Adam. We used to go to LAN parties together. So
You're getting a lot of nostalgia here. So this is like LAN parties, 2005. These sorts of tech meetup, non-hackathon, jams. I mean, that was like way early days, right? I mean, that was very early days. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it's kind of, I've given a talk about this once, and it was kind of interesting to kind of go back and realize like that was literally at the dawn of Web 2.0. Like it was basically like a year or two after Wikipedia came into existence. Like that's a weird thing. GitHub sort of was not quite even around yet.
Yeah, I mean, that started like 2008, 2009.
2007, right? Yeah. I was actually doing a competitor to GitHub at the time, and actually led to sort of this, like the discovery of webhooks or whatever that I started popularizing, which GitHub then started using, and then just because they ended up having a better product, I sort of gave up because I'm not a very competitive person. There's sort of a lot of things that I want to accomplish. So if somebody else is doing something I wanted to do better, then I'm just going to let them do it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a cool theme that we could, float in the air, right? Because this idea that a lot of times, if these inventions or discoveries, as you say, are kind of in the air at that time, right? So multiple people kind of come upon these things, and then it's the ones who are the most business-minded. I mean, Docker is a great example, right? It's the ones who are the most business-minded and have that critical mass around an enterprise business or something that really takes it, or you have a big company backing it. But there are many people around those times playing with these ideas, which is what I find fascinating.
Yeah, and most of those people were coming to Dev House. Like when Twitter was like 5 engineers, they all came to Dev House, and I'm trying to one of the original architects, Blaine Cook and Chris Messina, who I mentioned, who helped do one of the first co-working spaces. They wrote the spec for OAuth, which is basically how every website shares access with each other now. So that's kind of interesting. I think loosely in collaboration with Cal Henderson at Flickr, which was like the cool poster child of Web 2.0 at the time. And he's now CTO of Slack, which is a big company. So it's kind of weird to sort of, Dev House was sort of like my college, because I didn't go to college, but imagine a college where like all the coolest people, cool young people that were going to do amazing things. Like Matt Mullenweg, who created WordPress and has been running WordPress for all these years and is doing really well. He used to hang out at the first ones. Kevin Rose from Dig came to a bunch. I could go on and on about like the
it's
cool
really,
people that
it
showed up
reminds
there.
me of, like in the late 70s, the Homebrew Computer Club in the Bay Area, right? Where the first generation of people were hacking on PCs. It was one of these things, right? For that mid 2000s era.
Well, and that was actually the intention. I grew up in San Jose, and there were kind of computers around and people in my family that were interested in computers. And so I was just exposed to it early on, but I fell in love with the culture of Silicon Valley and the stories and the lore and like the story of Apple and the story of the Homebrew Computer Club at a really young age, and sort of discovered hacker culture, but kind of felt, I don't think this is more of I don't think I felt this at the time, but looking back, it's kind of like, it seemed like something like Homebrew was missing. And I think you could say the same thing now, because what the dynamics of Homebrew was like, it was kind of this casual meetup that everybody came to. There's kind of like a show and tell and kind of a cool like mapping, like getting people to do a quick announcement or ask a question, and this like group of really talented hacker engineers that are sort of there just because they're curious about computers, could help out. And most of those people ended up starting companies. And so because it basically sucked all the energy out of the thing, because everybody that was involved is now doing like companies. And so Homebrew kind of disappeared. And then that spirit was kind of lost to corporations. Like the 90s, there was nothing like Homebrew. There were maybe user meetups, but those were like corporate events, basically marketing events. And then also around 2005, there was a lot of those like event websites. I'm trying to think of
like these meetups that were organized by these early Eventbrite or Evite or those.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember some of the hip ones that we used, but those led to a lot of meetups that were more like user driven and driven by passion and curiosity than like companies. And because I grew up doing LAN parties, I kind
What
of
did you do at LAN parties? What was your LAN parties about? This is in the 90s, I would assume, like kind of late 90s, maybe.
Yeah, early 2000s,
Okay.
I think. So I sort of, my first kind of LAN party experiences. My dad started an internet company in 1994 called Galaxy Net, sort of before the internet, or before the web was really even commercially viable. Which it was actually a tip by my grandmother. She was an internet early adopter in the early 90s, and maybe even before. So, starting a company at the time, you're probably going to succeed if you're not like terrible. But they did get to a point where they were serving like 1% of the world's internet traffic, which was crazy, like a hosting through hosting services. But so they had this office, and my dad would hire basically like 19, 20-year-olds. Because I mean, they were the ones who kind of knew what they were doing, I guess. And all the new technologies. And so I was, like 12 or so, mid 90s. So I was hanging out with these big kids that were just, having fun at this office, like doing what they love. And we ended up playing games in the office and on the actual LAN. It's like, this is really cool. I started inviting my friends over to the office to play games on the computers that were in the office. My dad kind of let me do whatever I wanted.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
And then, and I tried to do my own LAN parties at home, but I had like a really tiny little room. And then, basically I started meeting people at school, high school, that were like, oh, I met a senior when I was a sophomore who was like, oh, we throw LAN parties at my house, and they'd have like a their garage in the sunroom, and we'd play Counter-Strike, put the two TVs
Yeah,
in the
garages
rooms.
are great places. Yeah, this is very California.
And then someone there was like, oh, I heard of this other LAN party that's even bigger. It was like 50 people or something in Los Gatos. And so we went to that, and we started going to that, and I met a lot of people that I still work with today.
And it was all gaming oriented. It was all gaming.
Yeah, but the thing was, like, there was kind of a lot of downtime because, a lot of people like break their machine or they reformatted. Like,
Yeah.
I remember being there a lot of the time, just hanging out because like my computer broke, like it crashed and I'd need to reinstall Windows or something.
Yeah.
But the thing was that was where you would find people that were interested in technology and computers. And so a small number of those people either went on into IT and DevOps or programming, computer science, including Adam Smith, Kathleen's husband. So that group of people, eventually I was like, well, what if we did this but focus on just like making stuff? And that was Dev House.
So it came out of that same social group.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's really awesome. And what's the lineage of Dev House, over the years? I mean, I've heard of it a long time ago, but I haven't, kept up with that. What's been the lineage and history of that in a nutshell, I guess?
I mean, that's like a whole thing on its own. Like, there's so many, like, I mean, they're mostly like all these little anecdotes, like Facebook's internal hackathons were inspired by Dev House because one of the product managers or engineering managers came to Dev House and then was having lunch with Mark Zuckerberg, and he's like, we should do that. And then they started doing them, and it became like a core part of like how they express hacker culture at Facebook. My friend who started Major League Hacking, which is sort of the kind of a group that helps colleges and some high schools do hackathons. It is huge, yeah. It's amazing what they're doing. He's given some talks in which he credited Dev House as the father of modern hackathon. Which I think is ironic because like the modern hackathon is very different than what happened.
Yeah, I mean, the spirit, like you said, it's this competition, very corporate sponsored. It's very, so just kind of brainstorming, nowadays, do you think something in that spirit exists, or is everything just so much about, oh, we're going to do a startup incubator and we're going to, do college competitions for pitching for startups and stuff? Because there's a lot of that. But, do you think there are these pockets that capture that spirit, that non-commercial kind of more independent spirit still?
Yeah. Well, I sometimes like to think not. You might notice I'm distracted by a puppy that I'm dog sitting. But and then that just ruined my train of thought. Sometimes it feels like there's nothing sort of filling that purpose. It feels like there's less of it, but I think it is in places that you don't really expect. Because I remember it's places like Recurse Center, and even just like all of these like Girls Who Code and all these kind of like community driven communities around programming, I think, are the places where you find that kind of spirit.
Yeah, and that's sort of kind of that meetup group thing. There's like, Boston Python user group and kind of newbies, like
there's so many of them now.
Santa Cruz, yeah.
I like to say it's not quite the same because those are sort of like, they're emergent, but they weren't sort of emergent with sort of the history and context. Like Dev House was very sort of intentional in that I literally would tell people we're trying to bring back the spirit of the Homebrew Computer Club, which actually got some of those hackers to come to Dev House.
Oh, wow.
Get involved. I was talking to the local newspaper that I grew up with. That was cool. They did an amazing article on it, and I said that, and then Lee Felsenstein, who organized a lot of the Homebrew Computer Club meetups, read it and he scoffed. He's like, kids. And so he came to he showed up at one of them, and he just kind of like poked around. He's nice, and he went home and he wrote a blog because everybody blogged then, and he basically kind of critiqued it, And so I was like, oh, he hates it. But then he like kept showing up and he kept coming, and then he really became part of the community. We did an offshoot, so more lineage stuff. An offshoot of DevHouse was something called Hack the Future, which was another sort of intentional, like, we wanted to take the spirit of DevHouse, but apply enough structure that it would work for kids. And we did it in partnership with the Tech Museum in San Jose. And Lee was involved, and he got his friend Al Alcorn involved, who was pretty well known for inventing Pong and being Steve Jobs' boss at Atari. And he was there teaching kids to solder, and kids would make their own version of Pong, and then he would play against them. Yeah, so that was really cool. That was a neat offshoot. I mean, there's all kinds of, like, Hacker Dojo was kind of another major offshoot, which was sort of a hacker space. It was in theory, on paper, one of the largest hacker spaces in the country for a while. And I sort of felt like it was maybe like a new generation kind of a hacker space kind of thing, because it was a little bit more co-working, but not so corporate, but also not like like there's this interesting balance. Like DevHouse was sort of like the cultures at the time. There's sort of like the old school hacker culture, which overlapped a lot with like open source culture.
Yep.
And like the hardcore, like, like free software, open source kind of stuff.
Beards bigger than yours.
Yeah. Well, I just have to get a bigger beard, and then then there was, of course, like the kind of startup world where it's like, I'm an entrepreneur, I want to start stuff, and I guess that my generation, a lot of us kind of became, the stereotypical, like, Silicon Valley, I want to say hacker dude, like, is on Hacker News, or sort of maybe anarcho-capitalist, libertarian types. But DevHouse felt like it was just a mix of all this stuff, because it was like, we appreciate the history and the culture of hacker culture, and we really focus on that. But we aren't sort of against, like, capitalism, doing startups and stuff like that. But at the same time, we kind of I feel like we already had a bit of a distaste for the extreme capitalism, or whatever you want to call this, like, late stage capitalism business. But and so it's just kind of an interesting mix, where it's sort of like, it felt different than any kind of hacker culture community that I had heard of before. But so it felt special. But yeah, that was another lifetime ago.
Yeah. So what's on the top of your mind nowadays? I mean, nowadays, what's, I've seen you moved, right? You moved to Austin, I think, and then you're doing this live streaming stuff, and forget about Web 2.0. This is no longer 2005. So in 2019, what are the top things that interest you?
Well, I mean, I have kind of a whole narrative of kind of my path work-wise, but I guess just starting with the last thing that I worked on, which we would say, like, the very kind of DevOpsy, like the whole Docker thing, because after working on Docker, which was, I mean, I guess that's an interesting story, kind of the Docker origin and evolution. I worked at Twilio for 2 years. I was like the 10th employee, and they're like a cloud API for people that don't know. That was actually my first full-time job, and I realized that I was actually, before I worked there, I was like pretty prolific. Like, I was kind of known as, like, someone to make a bunch of cool stuff. And I realized while working at Twilio, I'd lost that. Like, I was doing stuff for the company, and then like half of it was so behind the scenes nobody would know, or like the first year I was working on a project that never even shipped.
Right. So all your mind, all your mental energies were put toward companies. I mean, which makes sense if it's a
Yeah,
very
and that's
intense job. Yeah.
there are a lot of other problems with working at a company for me too. Like I think very systemically, and because it's sort of like this is a place where I'm doing my work, I want to take some ownership of that, and so all the company's problems become my problems, and it's very stressful in the chaotic situation of like a growing startup,
Yeah, sure.
where it's messy. Like you can't do things right. Like
That's
stuff
right.
is gonna go wrong. So, but I learned a lot. Like I remember that's where it was almost like more research time for me. Like I learned more about high performance, high scale messaging systems, and a lot more about distributed systems. And that's kind of where I got into a lot of the type of stuff that I would work on afterwards. And at the end of Twilio, and Twilio was already ahead of its time in terms of its system architecture. They had made a very robust system that worked on EC2 before people knew how to do that. Like they built a system that was just fault tolerant. Like there were all these outage, an outage on an AWS would knock out an entire startup at that time, but Twilio was never affected by those in the same way. So it was already kind of ahead of its time, but there were a lot of like difficulties with the pipeline and the infrastructure. And so I applied this idea called idealized design after sort of helping start kind of a platform team or an infrastructure team, like a dedicated. We split like the engineering team in two, and then we split it, and then we divided it by 3 so that there was then like an operations team. And so I was on that team and sort of pushed us to do this process that's called idealized design. Excuse me, which kind of segues into like design thinking, but actually is I discovered it through the world systems thinking, Russell Aikoff, and that kind of
So I can
stuff.
Google that term. That's a known term that I can find.
Idealized design. Yeah, you'll probably find articles.
Cool.
This basically the story of idealized design that Aikoff likes to talk about. There's also a book on it. But it's the general idea is, that when you're inventing something, you're sort of already doing this thing where you're sort of idealizing it in your head. But once it exists, that becomes a little bit difficult because you start focusing less on the ideal and focusing on what you have, which is a good thing. But when you have a system that's really complicated, like a large organization, for example, the organization usually evolves to be more reactive to things that happen in the organization, and you're solving, you're kind of, even if you aren't reactive and you get to a point where you're sort of like proactive and kind of planning stuff, it's usually all just sort of thinking about things in terms of where things are, the problems you need to fix now. And you might have like some goals, like some quarterly goal, metrics that you're trying to reach, but those are numeric things. It's not like a qualitative like design thing. So excuse me, idealized design is about imagining that everything you have is sort of like that you started over, that you threw it away, and now idealize with everything that because you're at this point, or as an organization, an expert in your domain.
That's cool.
Now idealize it and just describe it and talk about these properties in a way that your constraints are, it has to be, viable, technically viable, and operationally feasible. Or maybe it's the other way around, operationally viable, technically feasible. So applying that process gives you now something that you can iterate towards. Like there's agile software development is very sort of an iterative process, but it's a very sort of like local iterative thing. It's like, where are you going? Where do you want to go? Because the thing has to work together as a system to get, sort of maximum value or output or whatever. So there's all these like systems things, and it makes sense.
Yeah, it's kind of related. There's a I did a podcast with my friend who's very San Francisco startup thing again, and he was talking a lot about how do you look ahead, right? And when you're doing a high growth startup, and every day there are fires to put out and there's stuff to work on every week, how do you think about these bigger leaps, right? And he framed it in a different way, but it's the same problem of locally maximizing everything. There's more than enough to do every day, but then how do you look ahead? So that was a Twilio experience. I'm curious about your, I mean, this is switching gears. I'm curious about your live streaming. I guess you are live streaming right now. And what do the live streaming thing and also your podcasting, getting back into podcasting, there's all very similar threads of, of media, I guess.
Yeah, I think a lot of that emerged from just being independent and trying to figure out how to do it, what I want to do, because there's a lot of things I want to do personally, creatively, that's just sort of like things I want to create ultimately for myself. And I categorize those things separately from technology that I want to build, which that itself I have quite like my big project now that sort of isn't, it's really like a very large scale project. So it's been sort of like in pre-production for a couple years now. And, I think I've described it as trying, like the goal is to be the most useful software in the world, which sort of without context, that's interesting.
Just have a landing page, the most used software in the
world. But I'm really interested in the idea that computing is special and that we don't really understand. We aren't even really taking advantage of it. Like our idea of computing, most people's, is not really the full potential of what these things can do because of the nature of how we got it to become so ubiquitous. The computer is one of the most amazing tools that we've invented because it's a tool that can become any other tool. And it's a tool that kind of is a compiler for your imagination.
Yeah, I like that term.
And yet, you can do anything in software, in theory, and yet it's so hard to do so many trivial things, even as a software engineer, but especially as a user. And part of that is just the way the systems that we have are not really like in the same way that like when the internet came out and the web, it was a very kind of one-way thing. It was all about navigating static hyperlinked sites. And then the whole thing about Web 2.0, which was there's this, it's funny how like the web that we know it today is a huge hack on top of the web as it was intended. The web was not intended to run applications. It was intended to share documents.
Yeah, document format, yeah.
Yeah. And so that to me, that's sort of the nature of like generative technologies. They will find a way. It's sort of the Jurassic Park thing.
I saw the web was a hack on top of the internet protocol. So I mean, the original internet, and ARPANET was not meant for thinking about today. Right? I mean, everything was kind of a hack on, and that's why security is such an issue and all the scalability and everything. But anyways, yeah, I like this vision. So keep going.
Well, but the specific story of like CGI, like I mean, this is a whole like little side story that I don't want to maybe get distracted with, but so I'll leave that. But if like the way CGI was developed is kind of an interesting story, and CGI is the key to dynamic content on the internet. It's how everything, it's what enables every web application. That's an interesting story. But so computing as we experience it today, I like to describe it as, I think I borrowed this from Chris Messina, pop computing. It is a commercialized version of computing. It is the computers that we get and the devices that we get are more like souped up appliances.
Yep.
I finally kind of put this to words recently. What we think of as computer literacy is actually application literacy.
Yep. It's being able to use Excel and Word and apps.
To me, true computer literacy involves programming. Being able to fully utilize the computer is an act of programming, or programming is the act of fully utilizing the computer. And so this kind of ties in, and you might start seeing the connections with your research. But so I find, I guess for a long time, I wanted more people to be programmers. And I don't mean that like I want everybody to become a software engineer. I just want people to be empowered by this technology, because I think it can. I think again, the Web 2.0 analogy is like, after Web 2.0, one of the defining characteristics was it became a two-way conversation because of the web app, because you're able to hack this format to then allow things like being able to post content, use the format to like then post content that changes the content on the page, like posting a forum post or a guest book, early CGI. But in Web 2.0, it was like all these like conversational comments, Flickr, social, everything. It became, we talked about like the read, write web, and like it became a two-way thing. And I feel like in general, computing is a bit of a one-way street. Like, we're dependent on application developers to provide us with solutions. We've not been, we haven't quite been given the tools, collectively as a society, to be able to fully utilize what the computer is capable of, because we had to sell things.
Yeah.
So,
and I wonder, I guess, just brainstorming off, I mean, we could go for this for a while, but just brainstorming off this, can you imagine another domain where users are empowered more? Like the domain that you wanted computing to, would this be crafts? Would this be people working on cars? Would this be, would there be another domain where it is more accessible to people hacking on things, or does that not exist anywhere because everything has to be commercial and, shrink wrapped and applianced, like cars nowadays, no one can get into because they're all just computers inside, or they're black boxes inside.
It's a good question. A lot of the examples I think of are like kind of stretches in terms of like a good analogy. One of the analogies that I've thought of recently, which came from trying to find a name for the project that I'm working on, which has taken like over a year. But when I was young, I really liked tractors and like big machines and stuff like that. Before my dad started an internet company, he was doing real estate development. And before that, like, there were people in our family, we had like tractors and our like backhoes, and so I was exposed to these like giant machines that allowed like a normal person to like move earth and like
it's
build
like literally
these
amplifying
structures.
labor, right? It's like you're amplifying our bodies, and computers amplify our minds in that way.
It's leverage. And so they always fascinated me. And kind of coming back around, again, this is maybe a stretch kind of analogy, but the tractor, like a tractor, because that can mean so many things, but I think ultimately a tractor is, kind of if you've seen like basically a backhoe without the front loader and without, because the backhoe is a modified. Do you know what a backhoe is? I know everything about trucks because
I'll Google image it. Yeah, I mean, I've heard of it, but I need to Google image it to get the image in my head.
You've probably seen a backhoe because they're probably one of the most common tractors, because they are so they do so many things.
Oh, I see it right now. Okay, I see it. Okay,
So
I mean, I recognize
it. The front loader, which you can use for a lot of things. You can use it to obviously scoop stuff up and move things around. You can use it as a lift. You can. There's kind of a lot of ways you can use this arm with a scoop on it. And then on the back you have this arm, and the arm has a little scoop, and so that has the ability to like dig holes. Yeah, right. Cool. But you can replace the scoop on that arm to be like a drill or something, and it becomes this like, it's almost like a leg. You snap these different modifiers on it. But even if you take the arm off and you take the front the front loading thing off, you have a tractor, which is just kind of like, it almost looks like a giant, kind of lawnmower type of, like, it's just a truck. Like, it's just a thing.
It's like a golf cart on,
but it has like
four-wheel drive golf cart.
like the defining characteristic is it has like a lot of torque. Like, it's got that big wheel in the back, right?
Yeah.
And because tractor, that concept of a tractor, and I didn't even realize this until I was thinking about it, but like that concept of a tractor, because then a lot of what a tractor is for is to pull stuff. That's why you need the torque. So you might be like pulling a plow or pulling a trailer or all these things. So you get a lot of you get a lot of different types of leverage from this one.
Is this a good image? I'm trying to look. Is this a representative image I just sent on the chat?
Let me see here. Yeah, that is.
Okay, there's the back and the front and the tractor itself. So the idea that these things come off, they're modular.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like, I think if you buy a backhoe, a lot of the time it's hard to actually take those off. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are. But you can basically buy
custom
a tractor that's not. Well, it's just kind of a weird, like, there are versions, like if you just get a tractor, it would be the backhoe without the front and the back.
I see. Now I'm on the Caterpillar. I'm just browsing around all the products. This is amazing. All right, anyways, keep going.
This is like my childhood. My grandmother would take photos of every tractor she saw and then send. I feel like that helped me develop a sense of taxonomy at a really young age.
Yeah.
But where I'm kind of going with this is this tractor was huge, obviously, for farmers and kind of this sort of agricultural industry, which, at one point was sort of like the dominant industry, or, like what a lot of people did. And these tractors were kind of like the embodiment of, or the product, or the maybe pinnacle, I don't know, of industrial revolution packaged up in a way that was now personal. Like you might have a farm and you have a tractor, multiple tractors.
I see. So one person could afford it and be privately used. I see.
And there's so many things that you could do with it. You could run a farm. You could like use this to do construction projects. You could be a freelance. You could start a small business being a tractor operator, and sustain yourself using this tool, which is incredibly useful, for a lot of different things. And this is just kind of inspiring. I don't know if you can make the connection to what we were talking about before, but this is just kind of a recent thing that I've been thinking about in terms of what I'm trying to accomplish now. I would like there to be something that actually gives us the full potential of computing, and I think the only way we can do that is to expose what makes programming great to more people, but specifically just to start, like making it easier for people that already program, or people that are already like power users or in IT or whatever. I'm kind of a fan of making systems approachable or usable in kind of a layered fashion, where you build sort of like an expert-oriented system at the core that is actually useful to professionals, and then building a layer on top that then makes that easier for novices or beginners. Because too often, especially in the world of programming, you create these like separate sandboxes where here's an environment that anybody can program in, right? It's like end user programming. Isn't this great? It's graphical, it's all, but then you run into limitations because like it's a kind of a walled garden.
Yeah, there's a ceiling effect, right?
And it's like you're kind of stuck with the paradigms that they've given you, and so you kind of like don't know where to go once you've like mastered that system, and because it wasn't like there wasn't depth in the system. You can't be like, okay, now let's turn the thing around and see what you can really do. Using the metaphor of like devices. It's like, okay, you've been using the front panel of your VCR. Now let's turn around and see how we can wire it up with something else, and do weird stuff with it. So that's kind of what I want to do.
It's a pretty
Yeah.
ambitious goal. And so I guess, kind of bring it back. We have a few more minutes, but what are I mean, we can talk about other stuff too, but I'm curious, what are the concrete steps that you're thinking about at this point? Is this something that you're just noodling around in the background? Is it something you're spending full time on? Is this something that you're prototyping some small thing to start with? What is the state of currently in your head?
I've been building some foundational things that I know that I'd need, and recently I've been kind of working on the UI paradigm that it would be, and so it's almost to the point where I can start building the system, because it's a system that you kind of have to explore to design. Does that make sense? So it's not at a point where I can be like, here's my vision, give me money.
Right.
So
There's no website yet.
Yeah. So it's all in my head, but the problem is, like, I've been quiet over the years, mostly because I kind of learned that you can talk about something a lot and most people aren't going to get it. A couple of people will, and that is good, but it's not until people actually experience it that they really understand it, particularly with new ideas. So I experienced this with Docker and webhooks. Like, I could talk about it, I could tell people, I could explain it, but until they actually play with it, they don't really understand, because like all these things are so abstract and it's so new and so different. Do you need to spend time with it?
Well, or if they have a demand, right? If there's a demand for it, and it's a problem they have, like, wow, this is exactly what I've been wishing for, right? Otherwise, things sound good on paper. A lot of things sound good on paper.
Yeah. That's something I struggle with too, is this concept of solving specific problems, and that's sort of the reason why we have computing the way we have, because in order to sell something, you need to be solving a specific problem, and the computer solves a lot of problems. And so I think looking back on like personal computing, like when the personal computer sort of first started, they had a hard time marketing it. Like, why should you have this? And they kind of threw out a bunch of weird ideas. Like, if you look at some of the advertising, it's like, oh, you could manage your recipes. Like, they're trying to find more use cases.
Yeah.
So the obvious things that actually did that were clear, like killer apps, were like games and business stuff.
Yeah, spreadsheets were the huge one in companies, right? Spreadsheets were one of the big killer apps for businesses buying a computer for every employee. It was spreadsheets. Yeah.
Spreadsheets is also the ultimate end user. It's the most popular end user programming environment. But obviously, like, looking back, like, computers could do a lot more, but nobody really knew that or understood that. And I've seen this again, like Twilio as a platform. Platforms in general, or any like very generative system, can be a hard sell to people that aren't driven by passion and curiosity. That's why I love developer tools, is because you can build something like Twilio and be like, look at all these possibilities. Like, you don't have to like be solving a specific problem. You could be like, you just open up possibilities and provide an API, and like hackers and curious programmers will be like, whoa, I could use this for this, and they'll know about it, and they can be like, oh, what if we use Twilio to
Yeah, and I think that circles back to the hackathon, the meetup scene, right? I mean, things like Twilio, I mean, they were very popular amongst the college hackathon scene, and so because people could just use it to like mash up web apps and services to make creative stuff. So it's very generative, like you said.
But it had to be like, there was a transition where, in order to sell to enterprises, they had to focus on very specific solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so that can be a difficult transition for people, because that is a different mindset than that of the hacker in building a generative tool, because a generative tool is by nature hard to sell.
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. What, I have a weird call. Hold on, let me call showed up. It's probably spam. Anyways, we got a few minutes left. I'm curious about, I want to talk a little about your live streaming before we have our final thoughts. I mean, is that related to you brainstorming these ideas out loud, or you do game development too for live stream? I mean, what is your extent of your live streaming interest?
I remember even working at Twilio in like 2011 and 12. I was like, oh, it'd be cool. I did a lot of demos, like pre-recorded things. There wasn't anything, actually streaming media was something that my dad had kind of gotten into pretty early on. There were a lot of things that he was ahead on and it didn't work out, but I guess it wasn't until I think her username is Noobcat.
Yes, Susan, right?
Yes,
Susan.
yeah.
Yeah. The live streaming coding. Yeah, I'll link to that.
She, I think, influenced a lot of people with her. She just wrote an article about how she's been streaming coding stuff for the past year, and I think that that inspired a lot of people to do it. Plus Twitch, I think people looking at Twitch is kind of an up and coming kind of medium in the same way that YouTube was, and it's kind of fun to get in there early, even if you're doing something weird with it, like programming, as opposed to like playing games on there, which is what most people want to see on it. It actually solved a very specific problem, which was giving myself structure. Like in order to build a community and streaming, really anything, you want to have like consistency, like consistent hours and stuff like that. And while you're streaming and it's public, you don't really want to be doing personal stuff like reading your email. So it just became a really useful tool to focus. It became my working hours, basically. So I don't really it's kind of evolving into something that is maybe more a little entertaining as I'm getting comfortable with it. But it has really mostly been a tool for me to be productive consistently. Like I have a good work ethic, but I also have ADD, and my mind is constantly going in all directions. And so having something like this.
Yeah,
really
I wonder.
helps.
I'm just brainstorming. Like, part of being in a co-working setting is that there are other people sitting next to you working, even if you're not talking. So I'm wondering if there's like these live streams where 4 people just go on Hangouts and you just work. You don't talk to each other, but you just see each other working, and you might take a break and stuff. I wonder if those things exist.
Yeah, I've thought about that, and that's kind of how a lot of people use it. At least my stream anyway. People tell me they put my stream on in the background and while they're working.
They just do their thing, yeah.
Yeah, and they're not even like, they can chat with me when they want, but otherwise they're just kind of like listening, and then if they hear something, they come and look at it. But it's kind of like it's a weird like one way.
Yeah, because you don't see them, right?
Yeah. But you're kind of co-working, and I've also done like voice calls while streaming with someone else, and we're sort of co-working. I want to do more of that, but
like you're actually pair programming or working on something together.
Actually usually working on something different.
Yeah, but you're just kind of there in presence. Yeah, I think those things are really relevant today. I mean, I'm keeping tabs on the live streaming scene. Just I haven't taken the plunge myself. There's a colleague of mine. I'll show you here. Let me just find the link. 1 second. There's a colleague of mine who's a professor here at UCSD. Also, what he does is he's not in his office now. He live streams his office. He has a webcam. He doesn't have sound, but he has his computer monitors. If it's all idle right now, but he has his computer monitors and his office just live streaming. Students or whoever comes in knows that he can turn it off if they want. But I think his desktop is small enough that you can't actually read the text, so he makes it low res enough. But you can see what he's doing all day. He's just checking his email. He's coding. He's writing stuff, and then someone comes in and meets, and I had him on my podcast, and he's developed a thing where people are comfortable if you have no audio. If you have no audio, they're comfortable, for the most part, and he turns it off if people really want. So it's just more of a performance piece than anything.
Yeah. Well, I also really value the community and transparency. Like, I'm working on projects in the open, and it's great to have kind of, if someone's willing, or if it catches someone's interest, to get more immediate feedback.
Yeah.
Some people have also helped me solve problems because of the stream. Like, we're following along regularly enough that they could actually tell me how to solve a problem.
Yeah.
With stuff that's not on the screen. Like, they've been watching enough to know the system that I'm building. So I love that there's now like an archive of my work on YouTube, and building a community. Yeah, it's all just, I'm trying to build systems to do I'm sort of applying idealized design to my life. I call it, lifestyle design, to try and find a way to do everything that I want to do on my terms.
Yeah.
Like I could easily do a VC funded company, but I don't want to do that because I don't appreciate the dynamics of that system. And so I have to find new ways to do things. But I have all kinds of constraints to deal with. Like, it's hard to talk about things that don't exist yet. And, it's like things that I've done before that I know is difficult. So I'm just trying to find a way to do. So this is kind of my way of just trying to like get by.
Yeah. I mean, it's your way of thinking out loud too.
Yeah.
So I guess we got a few minutes left. I'll give you the final word on, on whatever's on your mind. I mean, just thinking about what you'd want to do for your own podcast, just, whatever you like to tell the audience, or, anything. I got a few more minutes.
I guess just like if any of this stuff is interesting, following me on Twitter or on Twitch or on YouTube.
All right, I'll link to your Twitch and YouTube. I'll find that.
Yeah. I hopefully we can do another one at some point, because I was really actually curious in learning more about your research. Because
we can. I mean, I can come on your podcast when.
Yeah. Perfect.
When it's funny because originally, like I was saying, some wires got crossed and were mostly in my head, because I skimmed it and I thought I was going on your podcast, so that's why I sent you a bunch. That's why I sent you a bunch of my stuff, because I thought I was going on your podcast, but that goes the other way around, which is cool as well. So when you have your stuff set up, you should check out some of my other ones. Like, one of the themes that I have has been around, independent creative people, right? I mean, I don't set out to do that, but if you look at the list of people that I talk to, a lot of folks share your sort of mindset is in your, I tend not to, interview.
If I had an audience that I wanted to change the world for, it's independent creative people.
Yeah. Independent creative. Yeah. And I think there are more and more of those people in the woodwork, and figuring out how to build community and so is super important.
Yeah. So this was fun. I know you have a talk that you're also doing in a bit.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah, I'm giving.
Or you're giving a lecture.
Yeah, it's just an orientation talk. That's why I'm on the office on the weekend. I'm never here on the weekend, but it's like for new admitted students and stuff. So I'm just giving a talk about the department and such. I got to actually finish my slides for that. Anyways, it was awesome meeting you and talking to you. We'll go offline. We'll chat for a bit more. But thanks again, Jeff.
Cool.